Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Is Israel's war on Gaza becoming a forever war? And now, with an exchange of direct attacks between Iran and Israel, is it becoming a dangerously expanding conflict? Let's get to the bottom line. It was a limited strike, but the Rubicon has been crossed. Iran launched a few hundred drones and missiles at Israel after Israel attacked an Iranian diplomatic mission in Syria and killed some of its top generals. Then Israel fired rockets into Iran, not doing significant damage, but nonetheless, and get this, Israel and Iran are now overtly targeting each other's homelands directly. It proved that the rules of the game in the Middle East are changing, especially after Israel responded to Iran's response. And with the failure of the world's big powers, especially the United States, to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza, is further escalation inevitable? Today, we're talking with Ussama Makdisi, professor of history at the University of California and author of Faith Misplaced, The Broken Promise of U.S.-Arab Relations, and Ali Vaez, the Iran Project Director at the International Crisis Group. Thank you both for joining us today. Let me just start with you, Ali. You wrote a week ago a prescient article saying the Middle East could still explode. This was before Israel had launched rockets at Iran. I might call that, strike, given the little damage that was done, sort of a polite strike after this. But what has changed now not only in the Gaza-Israel crisis, but in the regional dynamics, particularly between Iran and Israel?
It's good to be with you, Steve. Look, in any geostrategic competition, the most dangerous moment is when the parties start changing the rules of the game. Israel crossed the line by attacking Iran's consulate in Damascus, and then Iran crossed the line for the first time in the past 45 years by directly attacking Israel from its own territory. So, and now Israel has, of course, responded, but it has responded still in a limited and stealthy fashion, which I think still falls within the previous rules of the game of combating Iran in the gray zone of their competition. So one can conclude that this chapter is closed, but I'm not sure if the parties have the same understanding of what are the new red lines, what are the new rules of the game. And in that ambiguity, I think there is plenty of space for miscalculation. And of course, the proximate cause for these tensions, which was the war in Gaza, is ongoing, and there is currently no end in sight. And so there is still plenty of risk for expansion of that conflict and regional conflagration.
I know you've just said that this chapter is probably closed, but what does the next chapter look like potentially in the region, given the fact that the underlying instability with Gaza continues?
There are plenty of risks. First of all, we still don't know for sure if the attack that Israel has conducted on Iran, firing 3 missiles into a military base in Isfahan, is a one-off or is a prelude to more attacks to come. That is still not clear. Second, at some point, Israel would enter into Rafah. I think that seems inevitable. And when that happens, given the humanitarian situation in Gaza, it is quite possible that we would see increased tensions. Iranian-backed groups in Iraq and Syria might resume attacks on U.S. forces that they have now stopped since late February. And there's also the possibility that at certain point we would see a conflagration between Israel and Hezbollah. I mean, they are now still at a low level of conflict, but I think the Israelis are extremely uncomfortable living right next door to Hezbollah's capabilities, given the trauma of October 7th. And if Israel ends up in a confrontation with Hezbollah, again, given the unclear new rules of the game, there is a risk of another round of escalation with Iran. And now that both parties have done unprecedented things, targeting each other directly, I think the risks are much higher. And both Iran and Israel, by the way, have demonstrated in the past few weeks that they don't have a clear understanding of one another. I think it's now clear that Israel targeted Iran's consulate, expecting that Iran would just absorb the attack and would not respond. And Iran targeted Israel, thinking that Israel is not going to respond, which in both cases have turned out to be inaccurate.
Professor Makdisi, really just a couple of months before October 7th, there was this active period of diplomacy around expanding potentially the Abraham Accords, perhaps creating a normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Tell us about how not only October 7th, but the Iran-Israel exchange. Tell us what the Middle East looks like now at this moment compared to 9 months ago.
Well, I mean, obviously it depends where you are in the Middle East, but starting in Gaza, I mean, it's ground zero for a catastrophe, a genocide that the United States has funded, equipped, apologized for, enabled, continued, essentially. So you asked at the beginning about a forever war. It's quite clear that this war has been going on the Palestinians for decades and decades, since the Nakba of 1948, and arguably since the creation of the British Mandate in Palestine. And as long as that sort of that core issue, the issue of the injustice of the Palestinians, the issue of their oppression, the issue of their statelessness, the total abandonment by the United States, of course by Israel, but also by the Arab states of the Palestinians, if that continues, we're going to see more and more of this conflict. So I think that's the situation. That's the tinderbox that leads to the kinds of continual flare-ups that we see in other parts of the Middle East. There are other conflicts, obviously, that are not tied necessarily to Palestine, but the core issue has to be resolved. And we've seen a massive, extraordinary failure of leadership, of imagination, and frankly, of racism on the part of the United States towards the Palestinians. So that's where we are right now. And Iran and Israel and their sort of shadow war and their direct war, as your other guest Ali just mentioned, that's just another element of escalation in an already intolerable situation.
Now we know that there have been findings within the State Department that indicate that certain Israeli military units have engaged potentially in extrajudicial killings and other human rights violations into specific individuals and companies inside the Israeli forces. I guess my question to you is, given the fact that there have been such little movement and such little success by the President of the United States, even in trying to restrain Israel, on this issue of attacking Iran, what is the U.S. hand in this anymore, from your perspective?
Well, I mean, the U.S. hand is direct and total complicity. It's not that the U.S. can't restrain Israel. It's the U.S. doesn't restrain Israel. After all, I mean, and you could say there are domestic reasons for that. There's a lobby. There's ideology. There's whatever. There are many different reasons why the U.S. doesn't restrain Israel. But it's not that the U.S. can't restrain Israel. I think the bottom line of all this is that there has been a consistent U.S. policy of marginalizing the Palestinians, ignoring Palestinian oppression, ignoring Palestinian suffering, trying to build a regional sort of architecture of domination that ignores the people of the region, all the peoples of the region, frankly, their democratic aspirations, their desires to be free, and instead to sort of cement a relationship between Arab despotisms on the one hand and Israel, which oppresses and colonizes the Palestinians on the other. And the issue really goes back to decades of U.S. foreign policy, in the sense that the U.S. feels and has felt for decades that it can get away with the basic formula, which is extracting petroleum and dominating the Middle East's strategic geographic areas, and at the same time forcing Israel as it reveals itself to the entire world today, on the Arab populations, irrespective of their wishes, irrespective of their desires, irrespective of the desires of freedom. And so far, they feel they're able to maintain this policy. And until that changes, we're not going to see any kind of peace or any kind of security or any kind of stability, frankly, in the Middle East. You cannot build stability on the basis of profoundly immoral, unstable foundations.
Ali, Ussama said something that caught my ear and very important, I think, that even Arab states have been somewhat on the sidelines of this conflict, have not taken actions that would necessarily lead to a resolution of justice and potential statehood for Palestine. I guess my question is, we're right now potentially making a mistake of conflating the Israel-Iran conflict with the Israel-Gaza conflict. They're both happening at the same time. I look at them as an escalation from Israel's perspective. But how high on the priority map for Iran is the Palestinian crisis?
Unfortunately, I think the Palestinian cause is a tool for Iran. Iran, in the early 1980s, in the midst of the Iran-Iraq war, realized that its strategic solitude is basically disastrous for the regime. But it really didn't have a lot of options to gain strategic depth and to be able to project power beyond its borders as a Persian nation surrounded by Arabs and Turks and as a Shia nation surrounded by Sunnis. The one thing that allowed it, Steve, to project power and transcend all of these inherent limitations was the Palestinian cause, which was left on the ground by the Arabs. But Iran has instrumentalized it. It doesn't necessarily mean that Iranians are too concerned about the Palestinians' well-being. And I think, in fact, the one thing that Israel could do that would undermine Iran's role in the region was to do exactly what Ussama was talking about, to try to actually come to a sustainable settlement with the Palestinians. That would be a nightmare scenario. I remember, Steve, when the Trump administration was putting the deal of the century on the table to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, a senior Iranian official told me, after looking at the package, this is great for Iran because there's nothing in it for the Palestinians, meaning that the opposite would actually weaken Iran's position in the region. And I also want to say something about the U.S.'s role, at least on the strategic level. It's very interesting that in the past few weeks since Israeli attack on Iranian consulate in Damascus, the U.S., in fact, has tried to prevent the expansion of this conflict. It has been, now we know, in direct and indirect contact with the Iranians. There was literally a hotline established through Oman so that Iran and the U.S. could coordinate when Iran was going to strike Israel to try to limit the casualties and the damage so that it doesn't spiral out of control. And clearly, what Israel has done in response, if it's a one-off, is also limited, which I don't think could have been achieved without U.S. pressure. So although I agree with a lot of what Ussama said, but I think the Biden administration deserves a bit of credit for trying to maintain and contain these tensions.
Ussama, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure, of course. I mean, the Biden administration deserves credit for allowing a genocide to continue for now, as you said at the outset of your show, for 7 months. So I'm not sure what kind of credit one gives the Biden administration. Clearly, the United States does not want a regional war in the sense of expanding. They're fine with having the Palestinians be slaughtered before our eyes. The U.S. just vetoed yesterday or the day before the Security Council resolution sort of advancing Palestinian statehood, as nominal and as theoretical and as conceptual as that is. In theory, the U.S. claims to be for a two-state solution, yet U.S. policy is characterized by, essentially, on the one hand, an extraordinary degree of anti-Palestinian racism, and on the other hand, a ludicrousness in terms of its contempt for its own statements: two-state solution, peace in the Middle East, stability. And everything the U.S. seems to do is to pretend that somehow you can build a stable Middle East without resolving the Palestinian question. And then to Ali's point about the business of Iran using the Palestinian cause as a tool, I think the word he used was tool. Now, I don't doubt that Iran, like the Arab states previously, all states instrumentalize all sorts of issues. So I don't doubt that whatsoever. On the other hand, I think the more salient question that one should answer is, why is the tool there to begin with? Why is there a Palestinian cause to begin with? What's the history? Why are the Palestinians left in the extraordinarily unacceptable situation that they are? Why does Iran, and before Iran, Iraq, and before Iraq, Egypt, and before, all these other states, Syria, all these states have used the Palestinian question precisely because there is something extraordinarily immoral and unethical that everybody in the region, and I would argue today everybody in the world, honestly, can see is unacceptable and want to end. And so, of course, states use every piece of leverage they can, every tool, so to speak, they use, but they use it because these tools exist. And we should focus, rather than on trying to say that they're just using the tool, understand why the tool is there and why it creates such a sense of injustice in the Middle East among Arabs for sure, but also I suspect among many Iranians as well. I'm almost certain of that.
Ussama, take me one further step. In the Abraham Accords, it was an effort. We saw an R&D lab, essentially, of trying to find normalization strategies in the region without resolving the Palestine conflict. Has that Palestine conflict now resonated with the so-called Arab street so much and created distance within those governments, those monarchies and those government arrangements within each of these Arab states? I'm thinking of Jordan, which has a normalization peace treaty with Israel, and you're seeing on the street major protests demanding that the government suspend its relationship with Israel. What is the distance now, the dynamic within each of these governments that this Gaza crisis has caused?
calling them the Abraham Accords is an insult to the common revered tradition of all the spiritual, of all the ecumenical and the history of coexistence in our part of the world. It's really a relationship between an expansionist Israel that doesn't pretend. Netanyahu is very clear. They don't want to give the Palestinians freedom or a state, and Arab states that are based on despotism, based on the fact that there is a huge gap between Arab populations. It's not just towards the Palestinians, it's also domestically. There's no democracy, there's no freedom in most of the Arab world, in fact, across the Arab world. And it's that absolutism and despotism that is the US requirement for a so-called peace process that is based on marginalizing the Palestinians. So I agree with Ali. If the US was genuinely concerned with stability, with actually making the Middle East a prosperous place, they would certainly have pushed for a peace process that actually solves once and for all the Palestinian question.
Ali, I want to ask about President Biden and America's brand and American power as it's perceived in the region. You know, I had this frame that America is perceived as an all-powerful player, a very powerful player in this, but seemingly impotent when it comes to really influencing the course of Israel. How does Iran, you watch Iran more than anyone else I know, how does Iran look at American leadership at this moment? Does it look at it as if it's floundering? Does it look at it as if it's being directed? Is this hugging of Israel during this crisis after October 7th enhancing Americans' brand in the region and making us look more formidable? Or is Iran looking at us as tied down into something we can't manage?
Iran certainly looks at the United States at this moment as a great power that is bogged down in so many crises around the world that is basically getting Iran closer to the strategic objective that the Islamic Republic has always had, which is to eventually evict the U.S. from that part of the world. They see the reluctance of the U.S. to use its own military muscle. They see the inability of the United States to deal with much lesser power like Israel, an ally that is completely dependent on the United States to influence its decisions, whether it's to address the humanitarian situation that Ussama was rightly talking about, or whether it's the trying to rein in Israel from doing things that would then endanger U.S. troops in the region. The attack on Iranian consulate absolutely could have endangered, or further escalation could endanger U.S. forces in the region. But you see also, on the other hand, the reality that at the end of the day, Iran is a much lesser military power, is under the most stifling sanctions that the U.S. has ever imposed. So it's that.
And we're threatening more sanctions now.
Absolutely.
But and do those sanctions bother Iran and Iran's leadership? Do they convey basically a sense that Iran's options are truly being curtailed by the United States in this? Or is this something that they can slough off?
Look, without any doubt, the sanctions have a devastating impact on the Iranian economy. There's no doubt about it. But the regime has survived. It's not thriving. But, with additional sanctions, basically we can get the dial of sanctions, which is currently 8 out of 10, maybe to 9 out of 10. But that one extra degree is not going to be a game changer. And if you look across the board, as a result of the sanctions, Iran is more aggressive in the region, more repressive at home. Its nuclear program is closer than ever to the verge of weaponization, which, by the way, what has happened over the course of the past few months, I think, is pushing them further and further in that direction, because the regional deterrence clearly has not deterred Israel. Their conventional military capabilities cannot defend their own territory in front of much powerful adversaries like the U.S. Or the United States. But if you look at the impact of sanctions, they have not achieved their objectives, and that extra degree is not going to be a game changer.
Ussama, we've just saw this Kabuki Act in the United Nations Security Council where the U.S. Vetoed an effort to call for full Palestinian statehood. But at the same time, every senior U.S. national security and diplomatic official and the President of the United States say the only way out of this is the two-state solution. Are you convinced at all that President Biden really believes in a two-state solution?
Just shows you the kind of levels of U.S. policy in the Middle East that seem to be at one level, and this is what we should be talking about, it seems to be far less about a kind of objective reading of the US in the Middle East and what its interests are in the Middle East, and much more about a whole range of domestic pressures and considerations that are put on US administrations time and time again, as well as ideology, as well as all sorts of other reasons why the US does what it does in the Middle East. Because the US could have, in theory, a long time ago, put pressure to resolve the Palestine question, but the US has chosen not to. And then at the same time, it claims to want a two-state solution precisely because they understand that what's happening on the ground right now is in effect a one-state solution, a one state where some people have rights and most people have either limited rights or no rights at all.
Ali, I'm going to give you the last word. The United States, during the Trump administration, did violate the agreement on the JCPOA by withdrawing from that and moving forward. And I'm interested, as someone who worked so vigorously on trying to get a third option, as opposed to appeasing Iran or a war with Iran, trying to create a third way here. Do you think that we're now back on a collision course with Iran, as President Obama feared we might be if we didn't get something like the JCPOA in place? Are we back in a railroad collision course from your perspective?
We are, absolutely. We're really getting close to an inflection point that I think if in the next administration, regardless of who the next president is, if we can't find a diplomatic solution to this crisis, I think the two options that President Obama warned about 10 years ago, of whether it's a deal or a conflict, will once again come to the fore, and we would be faced with that unpalatable choice on both sides. With one difference, Steve, that now, as a result of President Trump's unwise decision to renege the 2015 agreement, Iran has significantly more leverage than it had in 2015, and it will be so much more difficult to put the program back in a box and under the most rigorous monitoring that had ever been established. And in other words, President Trump took Iran's nuclear program out of that box and put it in a microwave. And basically, there is no going back. So we can never get a deal that was as good as the 2015 deal. And digesting that, I think, for Washington's political environment is going to be extremely difficult, to agree to Iran having a much larger capacity and also offering sanctions relief to an Iranian regime that is on the wrong side of the war in Ukraine or what's happening in the Middle East is going to be politically even costlier for the next administration.
Well, look, I want to thank you both. Ussama Makdisi, UC Berkeley Professor of History, and Ali Vaez, Iran Project Director at the International Crisis Group. Thank you both so much for being with us today. So what's the bottom line? Tit-for-tat escalation may not happen right away, like in the movies, but everything in the Middle East is just getting much more complicated and dangerous. For U.S. President Joe Biden, it seems to me he's just gotten used to being ignored. After pleading with Israel to not respond to Iran's attacks, it did. But as long as he's so deeply entwined with Israel and will be on its side no matter what, Joe Biden matters less. Meanwhile, Israel's anxieties will get worse. Killing almost 15,000 Palestinian children in Gaza, plus 10,000 women and 10,000 men, has not made it feel more safe and secure. And being bombarded by Hezbollah on a daily basis definitely doesn't help. And the more trigger-happy Israel gets, the more queasy Iran gets, driving forward its nuclear program, which in turn triggers an arms race in the region, with Saudi Arabia in the market for nuclear capabilities these days. In the meantime, Gaza boils in despair and injustice in what looks like a conflict without end. So it's hard to see much getting better for a very long time. And that's the bottom line.